our conference, circular economy is also a topic. Our conference will start live next Monday. We will also have sessions on the topic circular economy and also about measuring or seeing progress in circular economy, but more from a European side. So also here, I think will be interesting to compare this and see what the differences are in implementing circular economy. And yeah, so with this, I don't want to really lose too much words. With this, I'm looking forward to hear now from you, to have an interesting session. And of course, if you have the possibility to listen in next week, I'm also looking forward to see you online or maybe even live in Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. Well, welcome to everyone. One of the things that we have promised with this session is to be practical and real. And so that comes, I think, from all of us to a certain extent. I really invite you to put down your phone, to click off LinkedIn, not be checking Instagram as we're having this conversation, because we've brought together some fantastic entrepreneurs and experts in this field to talk to you about what's really happening on the ground for them. And so this is not about concepts, this is not about ideologies, this is about what does it look like in practice. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Footprint, and then I'm going to hand over to Randy, who's going to talk to you more about the framework. So we, as you can see, are very, very passionate about circular economy and about doing things differently. And we see that happening no more than on the African continent. We have seen so many examples of that. The work we do predominantly, we focus on supporting entrepreneurs. And so we run programs to support them to improve their social and environmental impact. And from doing that, one of the things we noticed that was, it's so important to have examples of best practice and case studies. But a lot of the examples that are being pointed at are not necessarily from the African continent. Meanwhile, we see so many incredible entrepreneurs on the African continent. And so we built a case study database of circular economy initiatives across Africa, and we found more than 500. And so from there, we started to see a lot is really happening here. There's a lot to be inspired by and a lot to learn from. But one of the challenges we're seeing is data. And another challenge we're seeing is that companies are maybe starting to talk about circular economy from a marketing perspective. They have marketing budgets where they've been able to say, I've got this little recycling strategy and therefore I'm going to call my company now circular economy. Meanwhile, we're working with entrepreneurs who are vertically integrating their value chains in order to secure circular supplies, who are going above and beyond to be as circular as possible. And they're being compared with others who just have a big marketing budget. And that frustrated us. We really wanted to be able to show that these entrepreneurs are making such a big difference and put some data behind that to support those entrepreneurs, not least to show the difference they were making, but also to encourage others to adopt these strategies and show what does make a difference. Circular economy is still in its early days as a concept, and we need to make sure that we're going beyond that. We're providing data and evidence. So we started to work with a fantastic collaborator of ours, Eric Bruce Lindgreen, who has developed a framework for measuring circular economy. And he'd focused predominantly in Europe with that framework. And we started collaborating with him to see, can this be adapted to the realities of an entrepreneur in Africa? And how can we do that to make that really relevant to an African entrepreneur? And so we've run now 2 pilots on that. The first was with 5 companies from across the continent, and the second was with 5 companies with support from RVO, the Dutch small business agency in Lagos specifically. So we're going to bring some of those entrepreneurs now to talk to you. But before we do that, I want to invite Randy to share a little bit more specifically about the measurement framework and the work that we've been doing. So I'll hand over to you, Randy.
Thank you so much, Joanna. And hi to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. It's always exciting when I have to talk about measurements, because based on the reactions I get from entrepreneurs whenever we talk about it, it gives you that edge to want to preach this more to other companies who are yet to experience this. Joanna gave a bit of context to what we've been able to do so far, and we were trying to see how companies can be able to apply measurements within their operations. And we've done that by walking them through the entire process, where they are able to find goals and be able to do measurements for the kind of impact they make through their circular initiatives. We've also had trainings for companies who are interested to do this on their own. The third one we did was to provide some form of a handbook so that you can always refer to that whenever you want to start doing this measurement. So for you to be able to understand what measurement is, where you need to be able to start collecting the data you need, how to do the analysis, and also what you can do with the results. So we produced this interesting reports, more like a guideline, so that for companies who are interested to do this, to give you a fair idea where to start, then you can see who to involve to be able to bring this to reality. So Joanna mentioned we collaborated with the University of Messina. Eric did a wonderful job developing a framework, and we are looking at putting together a system or a structure that we can use to support companies to measure the impacts they are making with their circular initiatives. But we didn't want it to be too complex where we are only the ones being able to do it, so that companies, even through the process, is a learning experience for them. So we made the system very simple so that anybody at all can adopt to a certain degree based on your measurement experience. But the framework that was developed is called the SAYA framework, which is the Strategic Circular Economy Impact Assessment Framework. So it has, it can be quite broad based on how you want to use this, but we included the possible environmental and social impacts that an organization can make with their circular initiatives. And we made it modular so that it's not something you have to follow throughout. You can just pick and choose the ones that you need to be able to measure the specific impacts you're making based on the data available or based on the measurement goal that you have. And we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. This is based on existing measurement methods. So this is not like a tool per se. It's more of us giving a system where the right tools can be involved so that you are able to measure the impacts you make, you are able to do with your company. So this isn't a training session. I want to just take you through the overview of the system so that you're able to see how we are doing this and how companies are benefiting from it. So just to take us through it quickly, what we did with the companies, for any company that decides to do the measurement or decides to go through the measurement process, we typically have them understand the need to do the measurements in the first place. So I'll use an example throughout these phases. So I'm a company and I'm into the production of tissues, but how I'm circular is I use paper waste to produce these tissues. So for such a company, for you to be able to start with the measurements, you need to be able to identify what your measurement goal is. What do you want to achieve at the end of this? Or it could be the vision you have as a company. You are trying to avoid the use of virgin materials for the production of tissues, or you want to use your organization to provide jobs which provide fair wages to people. So once you are able to identify this, we also try and see the measurement experience you have. Once we know this, is easy for us to see the kind of support we can give you and for us to know what you can easily provide us when it comes to the analysis and the data collection. So by knowing your measurement goal, we can then narrow down on where your key impact areas are. And it could be a whole a long list of these impact areas. Let's look at the same paper recycling company I'm talking about. If this is for you to be able to avoid the use of virgin materials, we look at the impact that has been avoided by not using virgin materials, but rather using waste materials. And we have to set a scope because for some companies, based on data availability or based on what they want to use the results for, they may want to look at the entire supply chain. They may want to look at where they do the procurement of the raw materials and just look at what happens during the operations. If we want to narrow down on just a specific part, this is where the scoping is done, and this is what will determine the data that we are going to collect. And based on this, we will look at the materials that you use and the resource and other energy flows that are within your current operations. So back to the example we spoke about, if it is on paper recycling, we can then look at the amount of waste you are able to recycle into tissues. We also look at the resources you use, for example, the water that you are going to use, the fuel that you are going to use for the transportation of the raw materials to your site. We also look at the energy that you use for the whole production phase. And this will determine the kind of impact areas you focus on and the kind of impacts that you are able to make through your interventions. So with the data that we've been able to collect, we have data on materials used, resources used. We then analyze it. So if you've been able to process 3 tons of paper waste. What is the benefits of that? Because of this, virgin materials have been avoided, its extraction. So we look at the avoided impact. We measure that. We measure the impact that has been you've made on the environment or your society based on your operations. We either compare the two to see how your circular initiative is better than the linear, or we try to analyze it to see the improvements you can make. And all this depends on the measurements goal you have. So this analysis is done just to see the quantity of the materials you are processing, the energy flows, and based on that, we're able to look at the impacts that you make on the environment. So once this is done, we have the data, we have the results. It gets to the point where you have to develop strategies, or you have to develop recommendations based on the data that you've gotten. So for some companies, because they had a measurement goal of, for example, being able to show this to their investors, you have the data now, you now decide to put this in your slide decks or whatever that may be. For some companies too, they want to use this to advertise their products. This could be you using the numbers on your website, whichever that it may be. But sometimes during the process, we identify other ways that you can use the results. It could be that we're focusing on just marketing, but we identify areas where you can make improvements in terms of switching from your current energy source to a cleaner one, so that as much as you are avoiding waste generation elsewhere, you are also avoiding the negative impacts that come from your processes. So once we have these strategies, we narrow down to the one specific one that you can make the most use of. Then we develop an action plan from there. So how do you make sure it's not just the data and the results that you've gotten, but you are applying this and you are using this for whatever measurement goal that you had in from the beginning. So if you want to use this to attract investors, you look at how you can use this to get more money to be able to employ more people, so that the vision that you had of maybe employing more people from your community, this is where you make use of that. So having that clear action plan makes businesses able to appreciate the measurements that have been done for them. So this is how the system is. Usually we make companies understand what each stage means, so that they see the value in it and they see how they can contribute. And as Joanna mentioned, we've done this for 2 different cohorts. They had different measurement needs, but basically they were from the recycling space, companies in the agri sector, and they were seeing how they can take advantage of the measurement data that they can get through this process. One company that we did this for is Pyramid Upcycling. Pyramid, they operate here in Ghana. And what they do is they collect plastic waste and they process this into valuable products like plastic lumber, chair shoes, curtain ropes. And they believe by collecting waste materials from the environment, they are making an impact. However, they don't know, they can't quantify this impact yet. So they wanted to see the avoided impacts from this, but also internally, where is the impact hotspots within, so that they can make improvements. And from the assessment we did, we're able to identify that for the past 4 months of their production, their net greenhouse gas emission was 6.5 tons of CO2 equivalent. And for them, they realized electricity usage is where they are emitting the most amounts of carbon emissions. And for them, they saw the need to switch to cleaner energies, so that they are able to, even though they are avoiding waste generation, they are also being positive regarding their energy use. And with this, we're able to give them recommendations on how they can be cleaner in terms of how they do their processes, and also look at opportunities that exist within this. And for them, they now realize they can use this to apply for plastic credits, where they are being rewarded some way, somehow, based on the amount of waste they're able to avoid by using, not using virgin materials, but promoting the use of plastic waste. We also did this measurement for another company in the second cohort, and we did this for Quadloop. Quadloop, they have an interesting business idea where they are able to use e-waste to produce solar lanterns, so that instead of using virgin materials to like produce the packaging and everything, they rather use waste that would have been discarded. Nobody knows what would have happened to it. They'll use this to produce something valuable, being a solar lantern. But they wanted to know the environmental benefits in numerical terms, so that they are able to use this to communicate to investors and customers why they should switch to their products. So what we did was, aside assessing the impact that their solar lanterns are making, we also looked at the conventional, and by comparing the two, you are able to convince people to switch to their solar lantern. And from this, we realized even though they are able to avoid the use of virgin materials in some places, the amount of energy that they need to do the cutting using using laser, they realize that uses so much electricity, it uses so much energy, and the impact is something that they can easily avoid if they are able to get cleaner sources of energy. So it became a recommendation for them to make internal improvements. But also by comparing the two, they now understand that with the avoided impacts from the use of waste materials, they can easily convince their consumers that this is what they are able to contribute in terms of environmental impact, and also for them to look at the benefits of using solar as your source of electricity instead of conventional energy. So this is how these two companies have been able to do this. We have a report on the first cohort if you are interested to learn more about how companies are applying this, but we don't want to spend too much time on this. I'll hand over to Joanna so that we have the panel discussion. If you have questions based on like the framework or what we've discussed so far, kindly put your questions in the chat box and we are going to respond to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Randy. So we've had a little bit of science and process, but what does this really feel like in practice? If you're an entrepreneur, you want to know the impact of your business. How does it feel to go through this process? I think one thing that's really important to clarify about what Randy shared is this is not a one size fits all. This is really designed to be appropriate for the context in which an entrepreneur is operating. And so there's some work, there's a little bit of back and forth required at that kind of clarification of the scoping stage, where it's really making sure that we're getting the right scope of work to help measure. So I'm going to now introduce the amazing panel I have here with me. So we've got George Thorpe from Mag Protein in Nigeria. We've got Laura Stanford from the Bug Picture, which is in both Kenya and Rwanda, I think, if I'm not incorrect. And we've got Randy. We're dragging him back into the panel to represent some of the other businesses that have been through this process, as George and Laura both represent black soldier fly businesses, although with slightly different business models. So maybe what I'd really love is if everyone could just introduce themselves so we can get a bit of context of the amazing entrepreneurs we have in the room. So let's start with you, George. I don't see Laura on my screen, so maybe Priscilla, you could pin her for us. There she is. Maybe Laura, you could rename yourself right now. You're under Randy's way I couldn't see you. Somehow everyone's called Randy on this call. So George, let me invite you to introduce yourself and your organization, and we'll do a quick round robin.
My name is George Thorpe. I started with Mag Protein with my business partner in 2017. Before that, I was in banking. At Mag Protein, we are harnessing the waste conversion power of insects to produce aqua protein for fish feed and organic fertilizer for crop production. We are a full cycle BSF producer and probably one of the largest in Africa at the moment.
Fantastic. Laura.
Hi everyone, I'm Laura Stanford. I'm the CEO and founder of the Bug Picture and also Loop Pet Food. I've spent the last 5 years experimenting with insects in East Africa, predominantly with black soldier fly larvae and desert locusts, contributing to research, innovation in the sector in the region and exploring different business models. And for the purposes of today, I'll provide insights into the measurement of our insect production unit in Rwanda, where environmental impacts were measured. Here we found black soldier fly larvae to replace traditional protein sources such as soy and fish meal and fertilizer. For like a complete picture, right now I'm focused on the growth of the other business I'm involved in, which is Loop Pet Food, which is a Kenyan pet food manufacturer where we're pioneering the use of insects
The connection is slightly cutting for me with Laura. I think is it, Randy, you're nodding also. Okay.
Yeah.
I have to say I'm very curious to know what her life has looked like over the last 5 years as her experimenting with insects. That's I think George, you can probably relate to that one. Randy, please share a little bit more about yourself and your role.
All right. So my name is Randy Adjei. I've been with Footprint since 2019. I'm currently the environmental analyst, and my focus mainly is to see how companies are applying sustainable practices within the operations. And currently, I want to see how they can measure these impacts they are making with their circular initiatives. And we do this for mainly SMEs in Africa, but there is a possibility to extend our knowledge in other continents using our reports. So that is what I've been focusing on for the past 2-3 years.
Fantastic, thank you. And Laura, you mentioned that there are a number of different elements to your business. I'd love to understand why measurement's been important to you personally and to your organization. I mean, as we mentioned, for Footprints, we've been very frustrated seeing other organizations come in claiming circularity, but without much behind it. And we also feel passionate to support entrepreneurs to have the data they need to make decisions. What's it been like for you?
I think it's something both you and Matthias alluded to, was the fact that measurement has been the measurement of circular economies has been prioritized in the developed world, such as Europe, America, anywhere where there is money and budget to actually do these types of calculations. So why this has been important to me and why this has been, or us in general, it's been so pivotal, is because we never had access to this information before. Something that every SME knows is that insects are good for the environment. And it's on every single one of our pitch decks. It's everywhere. And we know it's circular economy because we're converting organic waste into protein and frass so that we can create resilient and organic agricultural inputs. But as an SME, we've never been able to actually know what that single punchy number is so that we can have that one slide on a deck that says we're doing it and this is how we're doing it. This is why it's important actually to you as the listener, the investor, or the person who buys our product. This is also, it's very important to be able to translate the information around why it's important into content that is understandable by the person who's buying the product down the line. Sustainability is such a wafty concept unless it can be put into numbers. And I think this is why this measurement has been very important to us. It's why we've been able to have bigger conversations. We've been able to contribute to the foundational knowledge about this very nascent insect industry on the continent. But we've also learned other lessons, which I think we'll go into, because I think that the most obvious thing is the single punchy number. The one thing that we can shout from the rooftops. But I think the process of getting to that number has actually been a lot more interesting. But I think we'll dive into it for the purposes of discussion.
Perfect. Awesome. And I'm very curious, Laura, do your customers care? Having that punchy number you mentioned about communicating, obviously there are multiple stakeholders to communicate to, from policymakers to investors and others, but do your customers actually care?
Now they do. Because now they have a number that they can hold on to. You can translate a number into something that is tangible for a household. Speaking for pet food, where we're now using these insects, that punchy number becomes something that people can think about when they're pouring the dog food into the dog's bowl, which has not been something they've been able to care about before. But now you can actually be like, well, you're actually making a difference every time you open that bag of dog food and feed your dog, which is really cool now. But up until that moment, we had a number, it wasn't possible. So it's very, very important now that people know that they are making a positive impact on the planet. But before, it didn't matter to them, so it wasn't so interesting.
That's really interesting to hear. George, how about you? How's oh, sorry, Randy, did you?
I mean, As part of the program that we run internally, we have some companies who do like research into what their customers care about. And some of them, like they use these terms loosely. We want a company who is like, sustainable, but they just say because these are like buzzwords they've been hearing. So sometimes when you're able to provide the data to like back it up, this is how you are able to say you are not just sustainable, but this is, exactly how you are doing this in the real world. And this is how you are able to differentiate yourself from the companies on the market who have also been using the same words, sustainable, sustainable. So it's interesting to see Laura already seeing this from their customers.
And George, yourself, have you seen similar, and why has measurement been important to you?
I think my answers are similar to what Laura has experienced. We here at Mag Protein are interested in understanding our value in the Nigerian food chain. And the reason is because we want to differentiate ourselves as efficient and a climate-focused solution for the food security problem here. And, there are so many alternatives to improve the supply of food ingredients, food processing output. But I think that our focus using waste allows us to take advantage of material that would be discarded in the landfill. And we can substantiate the value inherent in this material to stakeholders and really give a benefit for the sustainable process that we've developed in-house at Mag Protein. For example, we can, in addition to suggesting that we have import substitution benefits for using our products, we can, let customers, stakeholders know that there is carbon savings when we divert food waste from the landfill, and that we can connect that to the increase in the carbon stock in the soil when our fast fertilizer, which comes from the waste, is used in farming. So this kind of bird's eye view into the circular advantage of our process is essential for us. And measurement of this kind of process and advantage can showcase to FMCGs the benefits versus alternatives and the advantage of possible integration opportunities for us and them in the future.
And so, and what has that looked like in practice for you, George? Like, what has been the impact of going through this process? What have you changed as a result, or what will you change as a result of going through this process?
We learned that we were using a lot of water, a lot of groundwater, and there is a big risk if you're trying to grow up to 2 tons of larvae every day, and you're using dry material versus with water, then you're using a lot of groundwater every day. I think, were very, very shocked at the electricity requirement for that as well. And we decided to focus on, seeking waste sources from food and beverage businesses that had higher moisture content than we were used to. That meant a change in our process. It meant a change in what we were looking for in terms of balanced diet requirements for the livestock. And today I think we've shrunk our groundwater use by up to 90%. And this is despite the fact that we've had a 2x growth in output, since this time last year. So a huge change because of the learning.
That's incredibly powerful to see what knowledge can do. Laura, how about yourself? What have you seen? What's the impact been?
So for us, I think one of the, I sort of alluded to it earlier, was the fact that the process, I think, was really important. And also like shedding light on the areas that we don't focus on when we tell our story. One of those areas was the fact that or maybe let me go back. When you're used to looking at data, you know how to pull out those key elements so that they become a powerful data point that can be used. And as someone, I can have a whole sheet of data in front of me, and it's and I'm just like, well, this is just overwhelming. But someone who knows what to do with it can turn it into something really beautiful. And one of those elements was the fact that, again, we read everywhere that BSF or insect farming uses a lot less land than soy. But every single one of those figures is different. But someone looked at our numbers and gave us an actual number so that we could speak with certainty about what that was. The other element which was really important was the eutrophication of the water, and that element which we hadn't even considered before. And that's also a really important story. But I think the one that I almost love the most is that we don't know everything yet because this industry is so young, and we all need to be contributing towards the foundational knowledge of this industry. And we need to draw attention to the gaps that are actually there. These gaps are getting filled a lot slower in a continent such as Africa because it has a lot less money. But we're also filling it in a far more creative way because we don't have that money. So you have a lot more people doing individual journeys towards filling these gaps. And it's about trying to somehow bring that knowledge together so that we can fill the gaps in our own African wonderful way. But pulling from the report is the fact that we need to shed light on the fact that we need more research. Not research in Europe, we need research here that is African specific, that is speaking our language, that looks at our processes. You know, as George's process and my process are going to probably be quite similar, but they're going to be very, very different from someone sitting in Cape Town, for instance, because it's a lot colder down there. So they're going to have climate control. And completely different from someone sitting in Amsterdam. But a lot of that money and a lot of the focus is on those people, and we need to bring focus to the more, in Kenya we call it jua kali, but to the more, I can't even think of the English word now.
Challenging.
Yeah, but it's the more creative way of overcoming a challenge as opposed to throwing money at the problem. And we can do that with forums such as this, where we have these conversations which shed light on what are the gaps and but also what are the real champions of people who are doing the things actually on the ground, not the people with the budgets.
Fantastic, thank you, Randy. I'd love to hear, from the other entrepreneurs that you've worked with as well. Obviously, we've got Laura and George here, but you've worked with 10. Have you seen any trends in terms of the impact and in terms of is what Laura and George saying, is this representative of what happened for the other entrepreneurs?
Right. And for these business owners, it's like they have a space of other, like-minded business owners who want to either learn from them, or they are trying to find opportunities to either scale up or see where they can make internal improvements. So for something like what George did, now that he has that hard evidence to back it up that indeed this is the avoided impacts if they're able to use the moisture from the feedstock. This is something that companies who are doing something similar can easily learn. And for the companies we've worked with, whatever they learned from the process, they were looking at how they can extend the knowledge to other sectors or other companies. So we had one company, and they are looking at the avoided impacts if they're able to recycle batteries. And with that, they were seeing how they can push this to policymakers. So it's not something they are only benefiting from the whole recycling process, but anybody at all who is willing to also start recycling batteries, this is what the person can also showcase to get investors to be interested, and for the policymakers to the kind of support these companies need. This becomes something they all can benefit from. So the whole benefits that we talk about here doesn't just come to these companies we have on the call or the companies on our cohorts, but they are always trying to extend this to other businesses who do something similar or who can learn from the process and also be able to apply measurements and use that to drive the change that they want to see.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the humbling things about working in this space, is seeing how, people talk about collaboration, but seeing genuinely how willing entrepreneurs are to collaborate together. We ran some sessions last year, some hot seat sessions with organizations in similar sectors, and we did one on black soldier fly. And it's incredible seeing how excited people are to share with one another. To Laura's point about building the sector together, it's so exciting to hear you say that. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about, what that looks like in practice. And George and Laura, you have an opportunity to share your insights together. But in terms of working with others in this space, how are you seeing this useful for others in this space? And what do you want to see next in order to help build this space for the continent? I'm opening it to either of you who wants to jump in.
Well, I can jump in if you don't mind, Laura. for us, what has been the impact? Yes, we have saved since February or March this year, we have saved significant volumes of CO2 equivalent on a monthly basis. We've also saved a lot of water, and I think that has benefits for, replenishing the water table below where the factory and farm is. But also, I mean, we're, harnessing a valuable resource and not utilizing it in a way where there are alternatives. We've also, I think, started thinking differently as a business and asking ourselves, are there other areas of the production chain that can also be unlocked for additional carbon savings or efficiency? One example, for example, is, the energy mix here at the factory. In Nigeria, some businesses are running with generators to, supplement the power that you get from the grid. And there are, I think now more and more alternatives for renewable energy. We found out that FRAS has 2.5, 3 times better efficiency in a biogas situation than normal food waste. And this already shows the, extreme power that, is left in the fertilizer that we generate from our operation. So that could also be a way for us to power the factory, by using a biogas system that's more efficient than typical, food waste biogas operations. There are, of course, carbon savings for that, and there's also the aspect that, what's the savings accumulated all the way to the end customer, the dining table. If we're, for one, waste and converting that into proteins and organic fertilizers that become inputs into other industry, what's the accumulated benefit of sourcing that value from waste and using it across the entire food chain? That's something I think, as a business, we can use to justify to various stakeholders, investors, regulators, government, the value of our process and our efficiency with waste. This can also be an advantage in the discussions with waste suppliers like Nestle, flour mills, the big FMCGs here, where we can say to them that we would provide more value from the waste that you generate, and that there is even a possibility that we loop back what we make in our production into your operation. So if we looked at Nestle, for example, Nestle already have an outgrower scheme here in Nigeria where they're sourcing most of their raw materials. And many of the large food producers are looking more and more to sourcing core grains, core raw materials locally because of the efficiency benefit, but also they're looking from their group head office in Europe for more sustainable sourcing. Now a player like us approaching Nestle and suggesting that we can take waste that they generate from their production process and convert that into fertilizer that can be used to grow grain for them, we're closing the loop for this customer. And if we can provide measurement along that value chain, we substantiate really the value and the carbon benefit of operating with us for the future. That's the kind of impact that I think we are thinking about, in the next 10, 20 years.
Are you already working with Nestle, George?
We are engaging Nestle. We have had a few meetings and we would like to speed up the process where we can access some of that waste, but we are also in conversation with them for a demo farm for their outgrowers in the next farming season in April next year. We're working with their local consultancy business who focus on administering and managing the outgrower scheme program for them. And I think that there's really a big opportunity there. And we can replicate that kind of model, not just with Nestle, but with many other customers, looking more and more to source material locally and thinking more and more about the impact of their process and sourcing along their value chain.
Great. So if Nestle is listening, speed up. We've got some great solutions for you here on the table.
We would also like, you know, if there are other stakeholders listening on the call, to also, you know, participate in the process. I think when we're talking about the frustrations you had mentioned earlier on, we have to remember that there is an existing value chain, the lateral value chain already exists, and it's been operating for a long time. But there are benefits for going circular and going sustainable. And more, if we're able to show the value in the measurement to these stakeholders, if we're able to have forums like the one we're having now, discussing really the various angles of circularity and the impact of the measurement, I think we can, you know, get more and more people on board. So I'm calling for many people to come in. I mean, you could be from consulting, you could be from finance, you could be from FMCG food businesses. Let's work together to at least grow the circular industry in Africa.
Fantastic. Thanks, George. Laura, do you want to comment on the... Go on.
Yeah, I think that exactly what George is saying is that where we are, especially with, I mean, we're obviously speaking insects today, but I think this is true to the circular economy industries that we see, is that as you grow the sector, it will have catalytic effects, growth effects on all the different players within the sector. And it's because you just have this natural pull once the sector grows, and you're going to see natural niches. You know, if we look at the very established chicken industry, you've got people who hatch the eggs and sell day-old eggs to the farmers who buy those and then make them into big, fat, beautiful chickens that then get sent to the slaughterhouse where they slaughter it, and then it goes to the distributor, which so that it ends up on the shelf. There are multiple players in that value chain. Currently, what we're seeing is that BSF producers are doing it all because we haven't established the industry and the sector to a large enough place where niches can start to evolve. And I think that's the super exciting thing about these conversations. And exactly what George is saying, you know, Nestle's probably never been excited before because of the risk of circularity and the perception if they get it wrong. They're also massive. So they're going to have a massive bet that needs to go right if it's going to have a good news story for them. But as circularity, as the likes of George becomes more and more established, he's in the news, there is this reliance and this responsibility and this acceptance that it's working. Then Nestle does get tickled and they're like, yes, maybe we are going to take that risk, because maybe Joanna's going to knock on my door and say, well, let's actually measure what this means for us if we do this. And then there's the bonus of that marketing opportunity for them. But I think this is the thing, as the sector grows, it's going to become more and more exciting as these different niches start to get pulled out. You'll have the egg growers, you'll have the specialty products like the pet food. It's not all about the animal feed anymore. The animal feed is almost like the obvious guy at the table. It's everyone else who's becoming so much more exciting as this industry starts to flourish on the continent. And I think, again, I love this point of we don't know what we don't know until we know it. There is so much of that happening at the moment. And what we see is a lot of it's happening at research organization level. And that means that that's open source information. So it's not hidden behind these very large organizations, very shut doors. And that research is also going to definitely start to filter into the way that we make decisions. You know, we did this research project in Rwanda where we confirmed the hypothesis that you could use BSF to consume aflatoxin contaminated feed and food. And then you can pass those nutrients on to animal feed, and then obviously also to, you know, the frass. Now that's a massive game changer if we're able to implement that at scale on the African continent. And that's super exciting. You know, no one's quite quantified the measurement of what that means because it is such a daunting aspect, but it's massive. There you go. There's a measurement opportunity for you. Massive.
I mean, I want to take a moment to celebrate you and many circular economy entrepreneurs. What we see is exactly what you're saying. You're taking the risks that others aren't ready to do. And you do so much, all of you put so much on the line to take those risks, and there's so much faith behind it. And not only that, you take on so much of the value chain, and it's incredible work that you're all doing. So I really want to celebrate all of you for doing that work, because you make mainstreaming this kind of activity possible and going into this process. I want to dig in a little bit to something you just mentioned there, Laura, about we don't know what we don't know. And then I'm conscious we have to go for a Q&A, because I know that those in the chat group. So for those listening, please feel free to start putting your questions in the chat, and we will open up for questions in a second. But you mentioned a couple of times the process and how the process has been enlightening for you, and that piece. And I think people focus on, okay, so I want to measure, I want to have that number at the end of the day, so that I can have that slide on my presentation that I can speak to investors and customers about. But tell me a little bit more about the process and what that's been like for you.
So I think the process actually makes you slow down. As an entrepreneur, you have your to-do list to do at the beginning of the day, and you just get it done. And you have the end, you have the end in sight. And so you don't really stop to breathe in the smaller moments and the decisions that you're actually making on an ongoing basis. And this process of stopping and being like, okay, cool, well, what packaging are you using? Have you thought about your packaging? Or is it that you're using the same packaging as everyone else has always used? Okay, so what's your distribution? What does that look like? Let's talk about where does landfill normally go in Rwanda, and why is that important? What is the setting of that? And it's all of those smaller little questions that create the little nuggets and the little pieces of information that allow you to drive decisions that you haven't even considered being a decision point in the past. And I think that's it's not that it adds up to something very big, but those little decisions are very important at making an entrepreneur stop actually and not just roller coaster to the end of the day. And I think that was one of my favorite moments and processes. The actual process was very enlightening because it made us stop and think and question, which was very cool for us.
Interesting.
Fantastic. Can be overwhelming, I imagine, as well sometimes. George, was your experience similar of the process and the utility of the process?
I think we had some experience with LCA and impact measurements. I think we've done a couple of trainings at MagProtein, so we had some background knowledge. Now, post the measurement, I think we're blown apart. Blown away. We started thinking wider, thinking, okay, well, maybe we didn't really have aspirations in the beginning for what circular economy and impact measurement of that would actually be. And maybe the LCA subset needs to be much wider, and who do we need to partner with to have, the right scope, the right understanding, the right methodologies in place so that we can really think critically how to leverage the knowledge that we get. We've also been lucky, I think, because we had, 2 or 3 different trials, other trials running also at the same time. We have done trials, nutrition trials for aqua. We had also done animals or research programs didn't just focus on the tangible. And what I mean by tangible is, how much yield do you get? What's the process duration? Is there any change? Is there a change in nutrient classification for various things? We also started thinking about the intangibles. And so how much organic carbon are we seeing in the soil before planting? How much are we seeing after applying grass fertilizer? How much do we see after harvest? Is this a result of our fertilizer? And is there a connection along the value chain that allows us to say to ourselves that, yes, we saved X amount of, X kg of CO2 emissions, by diverting this form of waste, and then running it through our process, the output gives, farmers not just a good yield for using the fertilizer, but also there's a lot of carbon that's trapped in the soil. Organic carbon increases. And we found out that with FRAS, you can double the organic carbon stock in the soil, just in a planting season, and that's a significant number when you compare that with the CO2 savings we would be getting by diverting waste. So the process was really important because it enlightened us really about the scope, not just being around water and, the pump or electricity use, but really about the business and its role within the food chain and its ability to provide tangible and intangible benefits to various stakeholders. So I think we are inspired.
Fantastic. Thank you, George. I'm being nudged that it's time to open up for questions from the audience. So I want to invite anyone who's listening to share any questions they might have. You can either type in the chat or you can raise a hand. I can't actually see hands, so Priscilla, you may have to let me know if someone raises a hand. So feel free to come off mic. If not, I have another question that I want to ask Randy. So please fire ahead from the audience. In which case I'm going to ask Randy. Randy, obviously you've seen this process for a number of businesses now. Is your experience that what George and Laura are mentioning is common across businesses, or can you give some examples of the experience of other businesses and some surprises that you saw there?
And I'm quite glad George and Laura didn't call it exhausting, because it can be exhausting if you don't see the value in whatever we are doing. We want you to make sure you know what you are getting yourself involved with, and also you know exactly what this is going to help you achieve. So for example, at a point where they have to identify the goals, some of them may be quite too ambitious. They will talk about trading in carbon credits. Meanwhile, they don't know what is really required. So by asking these questions, you then are able to narrow down the most important indicator for you to focus on. So for the companies, usually based on the level of experience they have regarding measurements, they will either come in with a fair understanding what this is going to look like, and they will know what they want to use it for. For some of them too, they come and they will let you know that they want to learn about this. I mean, they've heard about it generally, what measurement is, but what really is in it for them, where we present to them some possible indicators. And for some of the companies, they get, like overwhelmed because they feel like there is so much that they can actually do, but they don't even know how to narrow down the ones that they are really going to have the most use out of. So the whole process can be very demanding, but as much as possible, we want you to know that it is for your own good, one, and also for you to be able to start thinking about exactly how you're going to apply the results even before we get to the end. Usually when we sit with the companies and we present the results to them, right away they're able to tell us some solutions or how they are going to apply it, which is always so beautiful, because the questions that we had them answer in the beginning got them to see what else they can use the results for, rather than what they started the whole process thinking. So that's how usually the process is, for you to be able to crack your brains and see how you can be creative with the measurement results.
Great. Yes, I think it is a lot of work, and I really want to salute those who've gone through this. I've seen a question here about the process. Maybe Priscilla, can you put the slide on that just shows the process again? And the question, which I think actually can be open to anyone, but do you believe that this methodology to measure circularity can be easily applied in other regions, e.g. in Latin America? So, I mean, obviously you will have a specific context, but how do you feel in that regard? So maybe I'll start with Randy, and then if either of the other two of you want to say a comment. And there's a slide just up showing that process for you, Andrea, there.
So yes, it can be. I mean, the reason why we talk about like African initiatives is because those are the ones we've like tested this with. So even when it gets to the point where we are making recommendations, it's based on what we've learned from like past companies. So it makes it easier for us to build upon this to do the selection. For example, for companies who don't know which policies this can drive, we are able to use the conversations we've had with companies in their sector, companies in Africa, based on like the conversations we've had with them. We're able to like give them straight recommendations. Because we haven't done this with companies in Latin America, this won't be as easy. But the system as it is, we want any company in the circular economy space to be able to adopt it. And based on your measurement goal, you should be able to like use these same steps to identify the areas and also do analysis and be able to generate recommendations.
Fantastic. I just want to make one comment here. So I'm conscious that this session is due to go on beyond the hour, but I know some people have to drop off on the hour. So I want to give George and Laura the opportunity to answer this question, as in whether you think this is applicable in other contexts. And then I want to give each of you the opportunity to share a final word or an ask for those who have to drop off for an hour, because I want everyone to be able to hear that from you. And then after that, when we hit the hour, then we'll continue with the questions. So if that's all right. So George, just a quick word, George, Laura, do you think this process is applicable in other contexts, for example, Latin America?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's the measurement of the impact of circular economies is very applicable everywhere on the planet. And we need to work towards making it more accessible to people who aren't in, the places where all the money sits, positive impact in LATAM. And with reference to an ask, I've sat with this one for a while. It's not such an easy question, but I do think that I would love to see more money going towards the different areas in the value chain where measurement can happen. So George alluded to the epic power of frass in the soil, but let's try and let's extend that to include that number, and so that the impact to the farmer is more obvious. So that's an easier sales pitch on that. Let's extend it the other way. Here's my selfish request into what it looks like if it's a premium pet food brand coming out of Kenya, and what would the impact be if we decided to export to Europe? What does that look like? And let's have a look at the different niches within the sector, as opposed to looking at these like the very heavy options of BSF production as a whole, which is the current setting.
So specifically, Laura, you're looking for support to get more data along the value chain.
Yeah, so from on the bug picture side, we work with refugees in Uganda to try and teach them how to use insects to create less reliance on importation, so the purchasing of agricultural inputs, so that they are they have more freedom to food security in their settings. So that's one side of the value chain, which is completely untouched right now and potentially quite difficult to quantify. But on the other side, we're working with a premium pet food brand, and that goes, much like the production of insects is a circular cycle, so the value chain is evolving to become something quite similar, where you've got a lot more different aspects coming into this, which I think could be very interesting to explore.
Fantastic. Well, if anyone has any support for Laura in that regard, then please reach out to her directly. George, do you have an ask?
I think my ask is similar to Laura's. I'd be looking for more funding to enable us carry out more measurements. I believe strongly that BSF and many circular businesses have huge impacts beyond the tangible that we've talked about. There's, the benefits for the environment, there's the benefits for the use of resources. And I think that if there's more funding devoted to that, we have more data, more knowledge to share with stakeholders that gives a holistic view on the value. My other ask would also be for funding to be diverted to the BSF space. I agree very much with some of what Laura has said about specialization within the value chain of black soldier fly. It's a very, will I say, important ask, because this we know will happen only when we can show the value to stakeholders of the BSF circular process. So I think the two go hand in hand. The funding for measurements should be able to drive more funding, I hope, for BSF. And that's what will allow us to build the capacity that will drive specialization, I think.
And I think actually that's why I would challenge you, Laura. You said this is a selfish ask, and I don't think it's a selfish ask at all, because I think both of you are pioneering a way that is going to enable more funding, more support for a business model that is going to have a radical impact, and is already having a radical impact, as you've mentioned, with the carbon capture in the soil, with so many aspects along the value chain of this business model. So for me, it's not selfish because of the way you're sharing the work that you're doing and promoting this business model for others to follow. Randy, do you have an ask, and then we'll return to the questions from the group.
I'm seeing some few in the chat box.
Well, I want to focus first on whether there's an ask you have for this work, and then we can go back to the questions in the chat.
Gerald, get you, please.
Whether you have an ask for this work, if there's something that you want to ask of those who are listening to continue this work, or some kind of words that you want to leave people with.
Right. Yes. So usually people either don't know how possible this is like in practice, the whole measurements, and for those who do, they feel this is something too complex that either they cannot get access to the resources to do so, or the right people to help them do it. But as we've seen today, it's possible. It can be very simple based on what you want, or very complex, whichever way it is. You can do it. You can put this into practice. And there are certain things you may not be able to do fully, but if you're able to see the value in this and the kind of data that you need to start collecting now, at the point when you are ready, it makes it easy for you. We have some companies who don't have like a strong bookkeeping system, but once you see the value of this, you then see the data that you have to start accumulating down now, so that it gets to the point where, I mean, it will definitely be a point where you are going to get stakeholders asking for these things. So seeing the value in this and getting the data available is at least a good start for you. And once you're able to like get the right resources, the right personnel on board, you can go through the whole process, get the measurements done. And just like George and Laura are talking about it today, you are going to also see these benefits in your operations.
So a pep talk for Randy, from Randy there, for any business who's teetering on the edge of whether they should do measurements. Thank you so much, Randy. So I'm just going to quickly jump, I think, and please come off mic if you're really desperate for your conversation, for your question to be heard. I've seen from Timon a question there around harmonizing the measurement methodologies across companies, regions, and sectors. So I don't know whether you want to take that one, Randy, in terms of seeing where there are commonalities and whether there's an ability to then start identifying trends from the measurement you've been doing across those different companies. I think, and Timon, please clarify if I've misinterpreted your question.
Yeah. I think for what we do, we usually hope companies are able to like learn from each other. Like I said earlier, we've had companies try to do this as a system, looking at the entire supply chain, all the stakeholders involved, and to see what they can do to make their work efficient. So yes, that is possible. Just that when you are working with like different stakeholders who don't see things from your perspective, it's hard to get the work done. So if this is what you want to do, you have to like make it your responsibility for people to see this value that we've been preaching, and for you to come together to have that common goal. And whether like a sector based on a region, this can always be possible when it comes to like applying measurements. We've had companies explore this. Some of them gave up because it was going to require too much time, which they didn't have. But these things, it's always possible, but it requires time, resources, that commitment, and you need that motivation to come from inside to have it done.
Fantastic. And I'm just conscious of time. I think we lost George just there. Priscilla, have I missed some questions? I think I have. I'm trying to read the chat at the same time as I see there's a question. Sorry, has someone just come off there to ask a question? George, you're back. Okay, I need to pin you then. I've seen a question on the size of circular economy. So what is the size of the circular economy, and how much money has been invested in circular economy in sub-Saharan Africa? I mean, that's a big question about circularity. I think that requires a strict definition of what circular economy is. And I think, as we know, it's a spectrum. So I think it's quite difficult to answer exactly how large the circular economy is. One thing I will say about circularity on the African continent is it's very predominant. It's very prevalent. It's practiced very widely. So anything from repair networks, particularly dominated by the informal sector. I mean, Laura's nodding now. I think, you can get almost anything repaired, and people do. It's much less a case of if something breaks, you throw it out and you buy a new one, and much more a case of you keep things in use for longer. And so there's a strong kind of philosophy and culture of circularity across the continent in that regard, as well as with cycling materials. So you have networks of informal waste pickers, for example, who will find valuable materials and make sure that they are cycled and keep them out of landfill in a very powerful way that keeps communities clean. So in that regard, it's huge in terms of how much money's been invested in specifically circular economy. One of the challenges we have, and maybe Randy wants to say a little bit more about this, is whether or not companies identify as circular entrepreneurs. I don't know if, Randy, you want to make a comment there.
Yes, and usually as part of the starting points, that's one of the first questions we ask the companies. What do they do that they classify to be circular? Some of them, they don't fully understand it yet. So I think that clarification sometimes really helps. But yes, these are some of the challenges we usually have during this first stage.
I think I'd also love to add on that, because, to your point that there is value far longer along the value chain in Africa than I'd say most other continents. And it speaks to the fact that, so as a bug farmer, I love organic waste. And spent grains, for instance, from a brewery is like gold to me. But if I didn't take that, I've actually got competition for that waste, because pig farmers also love organic waste. And as a result, is a pig farmer who uses spent grains from a brewery, should he be considered a circular economy company? And this is, I think, to the struggle of definition on the continent, is that he definitely wouldn't think that he's part of the circular economy, even though he really is. The amount of food that actually goes to landfill and the composition of landfill waste on the African continent is significantly and fundamentally different to what it looks like anywhere else in the world. And it's because waste is not waste here. Waste has a value right until the very end, especially in poorer communities where any form of food is precious. So I think it is, to Joanna's point, I think there's a lot of money flooding towards the circular economy on the continent, but I think the definition of who is part of that economy is a lot more complicated than we think.
And I think this is the point where, those who are jumping on the buzzwords are oftentimes getting favored from those who are actually doing this work, but maybe don't consider themselves that way. So I think that's where we have to be really careful about kind of a shiny presentation that uses all the right words and really look deeper and see kind of what is actually substantial beneath it. I think that it would be a good time to call this to a close. We've had a fantastic discussion, amazing insights as ever. I'm always humbled by listening to the passion and the hard work that goes into the work that you're all doing on the ground. It really is, you really are having to reinvent the wheel many times, and create markets for the work that you're doing, educate customers, educate your suppliers, your value chain, policymakers, everything. And it's tiring and exhausting work, as Randy said, to go above and beyond, and then try to add this research layer where you're providing data that can help others. Obviously, there is a self-interest too, but that can help others to adopt these models is huge. And you really are making an incredible difference. So I want to say an enormous thank you both for spending your time on this panel with us, and also just for the work that you're doing. Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure and a privilege to engage with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone.
Thanks, everyone. All right.